It wasn't my fault I was told to leave. They made me out to be the bad guy, like I was dangerous or something. I wasn't. All I wanted was to see my kids. They'd always been my whole world, and now I wasn't even allowed in the house anymore. The papers they handed me said I couldn't come within 200 feet, as if that would stop me from loving them. As if a piece of paper could erase everything I'd done for them. The first night I went back, it was just to look. I parked down the street far enough that no one would notice and walked up the hill. The house was still the same, cream siding, the porch light flickering like it always did when the bulb was about to go. I stood behind the tree line at the edge of the yard where I could see the living room window. The curtains were drawn, but the light was on inside. I could picture them in there, the kids on the couch, maybe watching TV. It hurt, but it was better than nothing. I started going more often, not every night, but enough to feel close to them. I stayed outside, always keeping to the shadows so no one would call the police or cause trouble. I didn't want trouble, I just wanted to make sure they were okay. The more I came, the more I noticed little things. The lawn hadn't been mowed in weeks. The bins were left out for days after collection. Things weren't being taken care of the way they used to be when I was there. It made me wonder what else was slipping through the cracks. One night I got bolder. I crept up to the back fence and looked into the yard. The kids' toys were scattered everywhere, half buried in the leaves. The swing set was rusting, the chains creaking whenever the wind picked up. I wanted to fix it, to go inside and grab a wrench or a can of oil and make it right. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring at the house, my breath clouding in front of me. The next time I went, I brought tools. Nothing big, just a screwdriver and a wrench. The back gate stuck like it always had, so I worked the latch until it came loose. It wasn't breaking in if I didn't go inside, I told myself. I was just helping out, fixing what they couldn't. I tightened the bolts on the swing set, cleaned up some of the toys, and left everything in a neat pile by the door. When I walked back to the car that night, I felt lighter, like I'd done something good. But they didn't notice. The toys were still there the next day, untouched. The swing set creaked just as loudly as before. I started wondering if they were even using the yard anymore. Maybe they didn't care about it, or maybe they were too busy to notice. Either way, it made me feel like I had to do more. I started checking the doors. The back one had a loose handle, the kind that could be jiggled just right to pop the lock. I tested it a few times, never actually opening it, just making sure it worked. It wasn't like I was planning to go inside. I just needed to know I could if something happened, if the kids needed me. One night I heard footsteps inside while I was at the back fence. The kitchen light flicked on and I froze. I couldn't see who it was, but I could hear them moving around, the faint clatter of dishes being set on the counter. I pressed myself against the fence, heart pounding, and stayed there until the light went off again. That was the closest I'd come to being caught, and it scared me. But it also gave me this thrill, this sense that I was still part of their lives, even if they didn't know it. Things escalated after that. I started leaving notes for the kids, just little messages to let them know I was thinking of them. I tucked them into the cracks of the fence or left them under the doormat. Once, I left a toy car my son used to love, the one he'd lost months ago that I'd found in the back of my truck. I knew they'd find it eventually. I imagined their faces when they did, the way they'd smile and wonder how it got there. The night I went inside, it wasn't planned. I'd been standing by the back door, testing the lock like I always did, and this time it gave way. The door swung open just a crack, and I could feel the warmth from inside spilling out. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house, the faint hum of the fridge, the clock ticking in the living room. It was like being back where I belonged, even though I was still on the outside. I stepped in before I could stop myself. The kitchen was dark, the counters cluttered with dishes and papers. I moved as quietly as I could, keeping to the edges of the room. I didn't go far, just enough to peek into the hallway to catch a glimpse of the stairs leading up to their bedrooms. I wanted to see them, to know they were okay, but the sound of a door creaking upstairs made me stop. I turned and slipped back out the way I'd come, my heart racing as I pulled the door shut behind me. That was weeks ago. I've been back since, but I haven't gone inside again, not yet. I stick to the yard, fixing things here and there, leaving little reminders that I'm still around. The kids haven't said anything, but I know they've noticed. I can feel it. They know I'm looking out for them. They have to. I've always believed that nothing in this world comes without a fight. My family didn't just happen by chance, after all. I built it with my own two hands, piece by piece, moment by moment. It wasn't perfect, sure, but it was mine. And things that belong to you don't get to be taken away, not by anyone. A piece of paper with a judge's signature doesn't change that. It's just ink on a page. It doesn't erase the years, the promises, the home we shared. The park across the street has a bench that faces the house. It's tucked under an old oak tree, far enough from the road that I don't have to worry about headlights. The view is perfect from here. The house glows in the dark like a lighthouse, warm and inviting, every window offering a glimpse into what should still be mine. I've been coming to the bench every night for 2 weeks just to watch. No one notices. People pass by, out walking their dogs or jogging, and they don't pay any attention. I'm just another guy sitting on a bench enjoying the cool air. No harm in that. It's funny, though. I used to hate that house. The paint on the front porch always peeled, no matter how often I touched it up, and the pipes rattled in the winter like some kind of dying animal. But now, watching it from the outside, I can't think of anything more perfect. I know she hates being alone. She's always been afraid of the dark, of silence. The kids probably don't understand why Daddy doesn't live with them anymore. I bet they ask about me. I bet she tells them lies. The living room light stays on until 9:30 every night. That's when the upstairs lights come on one after the other. The kids' rooms first, then hers. By 9:45, the house goes dark except for the porch light, the same yellow bulb that's been there since the day we moved in. I've timed it. I know her schedule better than she does. It's all routine. People fall into habits, and habits make it easy to predict where they'll be and when. She probably thinks she's safe, that the locked doors and drawn curtains are enough to keep me out. She's wrong. I've been planning this carefully. I know every creak in the floorboards, every squeaky hinge. I know which window has the broken latch. I left it broken on purpose when I fixed the others, figuring we'd get to it eventually. We never did. Funny how things work out like that. The night is quiet, the street empty, the neighborhood feels smaller than it used to, like it's closing in on itself. It's the kind of night where you can hear the faint buzz of a street lamp from across the road. The houses are all the same, neatly trimmed lawns, shutters painted in pastel colors. But this house, my house, stands out. It always has. I cross the street when the last light upstairs goes out. The porch steps are soft underfoot, the wood giving slightly as I climb them. The air smells like pine and damp earth. I glance over my shoulder once, just to be sure, but no one's around. The door is locked, of course, but that doesn't matter. I don't need the door. The window is around the side, behind the row of rose bushes I planted years ago. The latch gives easily when I lift it, just like I knew it would. The glass slides up without a sound, and I slip inside. The living room feels smaller than I remember. The furniture rearranged. She's moved things, made it her own, but it still smells the same. Vanilla candles and fabric softener. My boots leave faint prints on the carpet as I cross the room. I make a mental note to wipe them away later. The house is silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stand in the center of the room for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The stairs are ahead, leading up to where they're sleeping. I step carefully, avoiding the fourth step. It's the one that groans under pressure. The hallway upstairs feels too narrow, the walls pressing in close. The kids' doors are shut, and I pause in front of each one, listening. I can hear them breathing softly on the other side, little gasps and murmurs as they dream. My hand hovers over the doorknob, but I don't turn it. Not yet, there's time for that later. I move on to the last door at the end of the hall. Her room is dark, but I can make out the shape of her under the covers. The blanket rises and falls with her breath, slow and steady. I step closer, the floor cool under my feet. The scent of her perfume is faint but familiar. It pulls at something deep inside me, something I've tried to ignore. This is where I belong, I think. Right here with her. I stay there for a moment, watching her sleep. My hand brushes the edge of the blanket, the fabric soft and warm under my fingers. She stirs, turning onto her side, her face now visible in the dim light coming through the curtains. She looks peaceful, like she doesn't have a care in the world. It makes my stomach twist. The porch light outside flickers, casting a brief glow across the room. Her eyes flutter open, and she freezes. The nights were the best part, quiet, still, with the kind of calm that let me move through the dark without being noticed. The town was like any other small place where people didn't lock their doors until they had to. At least, that's how I remember it being when I grew up. These days, locks and cameras are everywhere and people think they can keep you out. But I knew this house. I knew its bones. It wasn't just a house. It was mine. My family was inside, behind those walls, walking on those floors. My kids, my blood, were sleeping upstairs in rooms I helped paint under the roof I worked years to pay for. She thought she could shut me out, but she didn't get to make that call. Not after everything. I've been watching for weeks, sitting in my car 2 streets away or parked at the corner out of view. I didn't need much, just the glow of the living room light through the curtains, the occasional shadow moving past. The upstairs windows were the ones I focused on, 2 small rooms side by side where my kids were. They didn't know why I wasn't there anymore. They couldn't understand why Daddy had to leave. She made sure of that, turned them against me, made them think I was something to be scared of. I wasn't there to hurt anyone, I just wanted to see them, to be close. I tried the normal ways, of course, phone calls, letters, even the lawyers, but she wouldn't let me in, so I had to get creative. I told the kids I wanted to surprise her, that it would be our little secret. Kids love secrets. I didn't tell them to leave the window open, that might have made them nervous. I just said it would help me sneak in so I could do something nice for her, something special. It only took a week before the latch on the downstairs window was loose. I didn't even need to force it. The kids probably thought they were helping, that they were being clever, and maybe they were. The first time I slipped in, the house smelled different. She'd switched to some new kind of detergent or air freshener. Something floral, but sharp. The layout was still the same, though. My feet knew the path from the living room to the stairs without needing to look. I didn't go far, just stood there in the dark, listening. The creak of the boards above told me where everyone was. I could imagine it clearly. Her asleep in our bed, the kids curled up under their blankets. I stayed for 10 minutes, maybe less. Long enough to feel like I'd taken something back, like I'd broken through the wall she tried to put between me and my family. After that, it became a habit. Once or twice a week, I'd slip inside when I knew she was home. I never turned on a light, never touched anything. I didn't want her to know I'd been there, not yet. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about reclaiming something, about showing her, even if she didn't realize it yet, that I wasn't going away. Sometimes I'd go upstairs, stopping outside the kids' rooms. I could hear them breathing through the doors, soft and steady. They were so small, so quiet, and I'd press my hand against the wood like I could feel their warmth through it. I never went in. That wasn't the point. Just being there was enough. The longer I did it, the more confident I got. I started moving things. Little things, a mug left out on the counter, a photo frame turned just slightly, nothing that would scream intrusion, but enough to make her pause, enough to make her question if she'd done it herself. I imagined her walking through the house, noticing the small changes, feeling the shift. She might have thought she was imagining it, maybe she dismissed it altogether, but I knew I was in control again. The last time I went in, I decided it was time to take the next step. The kids had done their part, and I'd tested the waters long enough. She'd need to face me eventually. The house was dark when I arrived, the only light coming from a street lamp down the road. I parked a block away, as usual, and walked the rest of the way. The back gate squeaked when I opened it, but I didn't stop. By now, the motions were automatic, through the gate, across the yard to the window with the loose latch. The living room was cold when I stepped inside, the kind of cold that settles in old houses when the heat's been off for hours. I closed the window behind me, careful not to make a sound. My eyes adjusted quickly, picking out the shapes of furniture I used to own. The sofa was new, but the coffee table was the same. I ran my hand over the edge of it as I passed. The stairs creaked under my weight, but I knew which ones to skip. Years of living here had taught me the quiet spots. I stopped at the top, listening. Her door was shut, the kids' doors too. I opened hers slowly. The room smelled like her, like the perfume she always wore. She was lying on her side, the blanket pulled up to her chin. Her hair spilled across the pillow, and for a moment I just stood there, taking it in. She looked so peaceful, so unaware. I moved closer, standing at the foot of the bed. My breath felt loud in the stillness, and I held it, trying not to disturb the moment. My hand reached out, fingers brushing the fabric of the blanket, and she stirred. Not enough to wake, but enough to remind me how close I was. It wasn't until she shifted again, her eyes fluttering open, that I realized how long I'd been standing there. She froze when she saw me, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. I didn't move. The drive across the country was long, but I didn't mind. It gave me time to think, to work through everything that had happened. She thought she could leave without a trace, that I wouldn't notice her packing up her life and stealing the kids away. But I'd always known her better than she thought, her patterns, her routines. It was just a matter of paying attention. I didn't even have to follow her the whole way. A few hours on the road, then I hung back, gave her space. I knew where she was headed. The new house wasn't a surprise. She'd left a trail if you looked hard enough. Utility bills, emails, little pieces she didn't know I could still see. A single mum of two can't vanish overnight, not without making a mess somewhere. The house was modest, like I knew it would be, with a yard just big enough for the kids to run around. She'd done all right, I suppose, but she wasn't going to keep me out. Not from my family. I arrived a week after she did. I'd planned to come sooner, but I wanted to give her time to settle, to think she'd gotten away with it. The moving truck had already been unloaded, the boxes were gone, curtains hung in the windows. It all looked so normal, like she was trying to build a life that didn't include me, but that wasn't how this worked. You can't just break a family apart and pretend the other pieces don't exist. That's not how families work. I stayed in town, not too close, but close enough to keep an eye on things. A room at a motel off the highway with a view of nothing and no questions asked. The kind of place where people don't look you in the eye, and I like that. Most of my days were spent driving by her house, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times. I'd park down the road just far enough to see her front door, the windows upstairs where the kids slept. I wondered if she told them stories about me, if she tried to twist their little minds and make them scared of their own father. She'd done that before. She was good at turning people against me. The first night I came to the house, I stayed in the yard. It was quiet, the whole street dark, apart from the glow from her living room. The television flickered through the curtains. I could just make out her silhouette as she moved through the house. It reminded me of how it used to be, how I'd come home late from work and find her reading on the sofa or folding laundry on the floor. For a moment it felt almost normal, like I could knock on the door and she'd open it with a smile the way she used to. But the locks were different now, and I didn't have a key. The kids were upstairs. I could see their lights on, faint through the blinds. I stayed near the fence, crouched in the dark, listening. Sometimes I thought I could hear them, little noises that carried through the night. I wondered if they missed me. I wondered if they even remembered me. I came back the next night, and the night after that. The routine was the same. Her light stayed on later than the kids, and I watched it flick off around the same time each night. Once the house was dark, I'd walk the perimeter, testing the doors, the windows. She was careful, I'll give her that. Everything was locked up tight, the blinds drawn, but it wasn't enough to stop me. The first time I got inside, it was through the back door. She'd forgotten to lock the deadbolt, or maybe she thought no one would notice. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, my breath coming fast as I took in the smell of it. Different cleaning products, a new kind of air freshener. But underneath it all, it still felt like her, like home. I didn't go far that night, just stood in the kitchen, touching the counters, the back of a chair. I didn't want to disturb anything, not yet. I came back more often after that. I learned her new routines, the times she left for work, the days the kids were at school. Sometimes I'd slip inside during the day, just for a moment. I'd move things, small things she wouldn't notice right away. A picture frame turned just slightly, a book placed on a different shelf. I wanted her to feel me there, even if she didn't see me. She had to know this wasn't over. It was the nights I lived for, though, the quiet of the house when everyone was asleep. I started going upstairs, standing outside the kids' rooms, listening to their breathing through the doors. They looked peaceful, curled up in their little beds. I didn't open the doors, not yet. I didn't want to scare them. I just wanted to be close. The last time I went in, it was different. The house was dark, the silence pressing down around me. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time, my hand on the banister, looking up. The light was on in her room. She was still awake. I didn't move, just stayed there in the dark, waiting for her to turn it off. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I heard movement upstairs, my heart started racing. I thought about running, but I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was so close. The steps were soft, barely there, but they grew louder as they came closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. The light from her bedroom spilled onto the landing, and she stopped at the top of the stairs, her face just visible in the glow. Her eyes were on me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She didn't understand what she'd done. It wasn't just the papers she'd filed or the boxes she'd packed. This went deeper than that. You don't get to erase years together, not when you've built a life, a family. She thought she could push me out. like flipping a switch, but love doesn't work that way. I wasn't ready to let go. I don't think I'll ever be. The divorce felt like a game to her, something clean and simple with rules and boundaries. But I knew the truth. Nothing about it was clean. It was messy and raw, and there were things that couldn't be undone. She could box up my clothes and delete my name from the joint accounts, but she couldn't erase me from our kids' lives, or from hers. I was still here, still part of everything, whether she wanted me to be or not. The first time I went to the school, it was just to check in. I wanted to see how the kids were doing, how they were coping with all of this. I stayed across the street, leaning on the hood of my car, sipping coffee while I watched them pour out of the building with their backpacks and lunchboxes. They looked fine, better than I'd expected, honestly. It made me wonder what she'd been telling them, what lies she'd fed them about why I wasn't around anymore. I thought about walking up to them, giving them a hug, reminding them that I hadn't gone anywhere, but I didn't, not yet. I started showing up more often after that. Always around pickup time when the parking lot was crowded and no one would notice me blending in. I'd park on the corner and sit there with the engine running, my eyes locked on the door. It felt good to be close, to know they were safe. But it wasn't enough. I needed more than stolen glances from behind a windscreen. I needed to remind her that I was still part of this too. The house was harder. She'd changed the locks, of course. I found that out the hard way, standing on the porch with my key in hand, the lock refusing to turn. That stung more than anything. It wasn't her house, it was ours. I'd built the shelves in the living room, painted the walls in the kitchen, patched the crack in the driveway. I had just as much right to be there as she did, maybe more. The locks didn't stop me from coming back. I started parking down the block, walking past the neighbors' hedges and crouching in the dark where I could see the living room window. The curtains were always drawn, but the light spilled through just enough to let me know she was inside. I'd stay for hours, watching the glow from the television flicker and fade as the night dragged on. One evening, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. There was another car in the driveway, a sleek, shiny thing that didn't belong there. I knew every inch of that driveway, every crack and oil stain, and this car didn't fit. My chest tightened as I imagined who it belonged to. I waited longer than usual that night, watching the car, staring at the front door. When it finally opened, my breath caught. A man stepped out, his face lit by the porch light for a moment before he climbed into the car and drove off. My fists clenched so hard my knuckles ached. She'd replaced me, just like that. The visits became more frequent after that. I couldn't stop myself. I started circling the block, pulling into the driveway when I was sure she wasn't home, checking the mail she hadn't collected yet. I walked around the yard, noting the way the grass had grown too long and the flower beds had gone to seed. She was letting everything fall apart, proving she couldn't handle it on her own. It made me sick. The day I let myself inside, it was out of necessity. I'd been standing in the backyard for nearly an hour, staring at the back door and thinking about all the times I'd grilled burgers on the patio, laughing with the kids while she set the table. My hand moved before I could stop it, testing the door handle. It was locked, of course, but the latch wasn't secure. With a little effort, it clicked open. The air inside hit me like a punch. It smelled different, like cleaning products and something faintly sweet. I stepped into the kitchen, my shoes silent on the tile. Everything looked the same but felt off. The counters were clean, the fridge free of the kids' drawings I'd taped up over the years. The bin was overflowing, crumpled papers spilling out onto the floor. She was slipping, just like I'd known she would. I moved through the house, taking it all in. The living room was neat, the coffee table bare except for a stack of magazines I didn't recognize. The photos on the mantel had changed. My face was gone, replaced with new frames, new memories that didn't include me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty spaces where I used to belong. When I heard the car pull into the driveway, my heart jumped. I couldn't leave now, not after coming this far. I backed into the shadows, my pulse racing as the front door opened and footsteps sounded on the floor. She walked into the living room, her back to me, her shoulders tense. I stayed still, blending into the darkness, listening to the rustle of her coat as she set it on the chair. My breath caught as she turned, her eyes sweeping the room. She didn't see me at first, but she would. She had no idea what she'd done. It wasn't her fault, really. She probably said the same thing to dozens of people, a little encouragement to keep them going, to make them feel seen. but it landed differently with me. It was the way she smiled, warm and genuine, like she'd looked into me and found something worth noticing. "You've got potential," she'd said. Those words had stuck in my mind, circling back whenever I doubted myself. She believed in me even if she didn't know it yet. I started arriving early to her class. It wasn't hard to time it right. I knew when the janitor unlocked the building and how long it took most of the other students to show up. I liked the quiet before the room filled up, the sound of her setting up papers or fiddling with the projector. I'd sit at the front, always the same spot, and wait until she glanced up and gave me that smile. I couldn't explain what it did to me. It wasn't like anything I'd felt before. I didn't just look forward to the lessons. I started building my week around them. Tuesday and Thursday nights became the only thing that mattered. I'd jot down ideas for the essays, sketch little drawings in the margins of my notebook, something to catch her eye when she walked past. She noticed once, picking up my paper and holding it for a second longer than usual. I thought she might say something about the drawing, but she just nodded and moved on. That was enough for me. She'd seen it. She'd noticed. I started writing poems too, not for the class, but for her. I'd slip them into the stack of assignments at the end of the lesson, folded neatly, unsigned. I didn't want to be too forward, not yet. It was enough to imagine her reading them later, wondering who'd written them, smiling to herself as she recognized the effort I'd put in. I tried to keep them light at first, nothing too serious, but it was hard. I couldn't stop thinking about her. It crept into the words no matter how much I tried to hold back. One night after class, I waited for her outside. I told myself I just wanted to thank her, to say something casual, but when she came through the doors, I froze. She was talking to someone else, another student, laughing at something he'd said. I didn't like the way he was standing so close to her, leaning in like they were already friends. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't mind. I stayed back, watching as she got into her car and drove off. The other student walked to the parking lot, clueless that I was standing there, wishing I could wipe the smugness off his face. After that, I started learning more about her. It wasn't hard. A name in the faculty directory led me to her profile, and from there it spiraled. Social media, old articles from the local paper, even the school website. She'd been teaching at the college for a few years, mostly evening classes. I found a photo of her with a group of other lecturers, all smiling in front of a banner. Her smile was different there, a little stiffer, like she was just going through the motions. It wasn't like the smile she gave me in class. One Saturday, I drove past the campus and ended up near her neighborhood. I hadn't planned to, but once I was there, I couldn't stop myself. Her address wasn't hard to find. She'd mentioned the area in passing during a lesson, and a quick search narrowed it down. I parked a couple of blocks away and walked the rest. It was a quiet street, lined with modest houses. Her car was in the driveway, and the curtains in the front room were drawn. I stood there for a while, imagining what she was doing inside, reading, maybe, grading papers, thinking about me. The poems became more personal after that. I stopped leaving them with my assignments and started dropping them off at her door instead. I'd drive by late at night, make sure the street was empty, and slip the folded papers into her letterbox. Sometimes I'd leave little gifts too, a pressed flower, a bookmark with a quote I thought she'd like. I never stayed long enough to see if she found them. That wasn't the point. I just wanted her to know I was there, that I cared. One night I parked across from her house and waited. The lights were on in the living room and I could see her silhouette through the curtains. She was moving around, tidying up, or maybe just pacing. I wondered if she'd read the latest poem yet, the one I'd left earlier that day. It had taken me hours to write, every word chosen carefully. I imagined her sitting on the couch, the paper in her hands, her face softening as she read it. It was late when the lights went out. I stayed for a while longer, staring at the dark windows, trying to picture her sleeping. The street was quiet, no cars passing, no one walking their dog. I almost got out of the car, almost walked up to her door, but something held me back. Not fear, just a sense that it wasn't the right moment yet. I don't know if she's noticed me in class. She doesn't smile as much anymore, and her eyes don't meet mine the way they used to. She seems distracted, tired, but I know she feels it. She has to. The connection between us is too strong to ignore. It's only a matter of time before she understands. I noticed her the moment I walked into the cafe. She was behind the counter, pulling shots of espresso with a kind of grace that didn't match the chaos around her. Her hair was pulled back and her apron was stained in places. But she had this presence, something that made the air seem warmer. When it was my turn to order, she smiled at me like she meant it. Not the hollow, automatic kind of smile people give when they're working a job like that, but something softer. I'd never felt anything like it. I didn't think much of it at first. She was just doing her job, being polite. But then I went back the next day and the same thing happened. She remembered my order, handed it to me before I even said a word. "It's nice to see you again," she said. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she said it, like she really meant it. I started going more often, sometimes twice a day. She was always there, behind the counter, that same smile on her face. She'd ask how I was, and I'd make up some answer that I thought sounded normal. I didn't want to seem too eager, but I didn't want to come off as uninterested either. I started noticing little things about her, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was focused, the way she tapped her fingers against the counter when she thought no one was looking. It wasn't long before I started changing my schedule around her shifts. It wasn't hard to figure out when she worked. I'd show up at different times of the day, piecing it together bit by bit. Mornings on weekdays, afternoons on weekends. She had Mondays off, I noticed, and she never worked the late shift. It became a kind of routine for me, showing up just to see her, just to get that smile. The first time I followed her home, it wasn't planned. She was leaving her shift and I was sitting in my car across the street trying to work up the nerve to go inside. I saw her step out of the cafe, her bag slung over one shoulder, her coat pulled tight against the cold. She walked to the bus stop and stood there looking at her phone. I don't know what made me do it, but I started my car and drove past her, then turned around at the next intersection. I parked a little ways down the road and waited until she got on the bus. I followed at a distance, keeping just enough space between us that she wouldn't notice. When she got off, I pulled over and watched her walk down a quiet residential street. She stopped in front of a small apartment building, the kind with peeling paint and a buzzer by the door. She let herself in, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the building, trying to imagine which window was hers. The next day, I went back to the cafe. She smiled at me again, just like always, and I felt this rush of something I couldn't explain. I wanted to tell her that I knew where she lived, that I understood her better than anyone else ever could, but I didn't. I just ordered my coffee and left, already thinking about how I could get closer to her. I started leaving gifts for her, little things I thought she'd like. A book with a note tucked inside the cover, left on the counter when she wasn't looking. Flowers delivered to the cafe with no name on the card. Once I slipped a bracelet into her tip jar, a delicate silver chain that I thought would suit her. I never stayed to see her reaction. It wasn't about that. It was about letting her know that someone out there cared. One night I parked outside her building and waited for her light to come on. It was late past midnight and the street was quiet. When the light finally flickered on, I felt a strange kind of relief, like I'd been holding my breath. I stayed there for hours, watching the glow from her window, imagining her moving around inside. I don't know if she's noticed me yet. Sometimes I think she has. There are moments when she seems distracted at work, like her mind is somewhere else. She doesn't smile as much as she used to, and when she does, it feels different. Forced, maybe, but then there are days when everything feels normal, when she looks at me the way she always has, and I'm sure it's all in my head. Last week, I left another gift, something more personal, a framed photo of her that I took from my car one night. It was a good shot, her face half lit by the glow of the street lamp, her expression soft, almost dreamy. I wrapped it carefully, placed it in a bag with tissue paper and left it on her doorstep. I stayed parked down the block, waiting for her to find it, but she never came outside. Tonight, I'm back at the cafe. She hasn't seen me yet, but I can see her through the window, moving behind the counter. She looks tired, her hair loose around her face. The cafe is almost empty, just a couple of people at the tables. I'm sitting in my car, trying to decide if I should go in or not. I keep thinking about the photo, wondering if she's found it yet, if she knows it's from me. The lights inside the cafe flicker once, then go steady again. She glances at the clock on the wall, then at the door. I don't think she sees me, but for a moment it feels like she's looking right at me. I grip the steering wheel, my heart racing, and then she turns away, disappearing into the back room. I stay parked there long after the cafe closes, long after she leaves. The cabin is smaller than I imagined when I saw the pictures online. The wood's rough, untreated in places, and the roof sags like it's been through too many winters. It's isolated, perched at the edge of a forest that stretches so far the trees blur into the horizon. It suits him though, he always liked solitude, the idea of escaping everything, and everyone. He thinks he's safe here. I'd been following him for weeks before he made the move. He was careful, changing routines, leaving clues that didn't lead anywhere. The little flat he rented in the city was practically stripped bare when I got there, nothing but a pile of rubbish bags by the curb, and a neighbour who thought he'd left for work. It took time, but I found him again. The paperwork for the cabin wasn't hard to track down. He left a trail without even realizing it. He always underestimated me. I waited a few days before heading up. The road that leads to the cabin is dirt, full of potholes and twists, the kind that doesn't see much traffic. His truck was parked out front when I arrived, the bed covered in an old tarp that didn't hide the tools underneath. He wouldn't have heard me coming. My car stayed just far enough back out of sight, and when the sun dipped below the trees, I slipped out. I've been here for 2 nights now, tucked into the woods. It's colder than I expected. The ground is damp and the air stings when it brushes against my face. The cabin's lights go out early, sometimes before 9. I can hear him moving around inside, the creak of floorboards and the scrape of furniture on wood. He's restless, but he doesn't step outside. Not yet. Last night I got closer. The trees crowd the cabin, their branches hanging low. I stepped between them, careful not to snap twigs or disturb the undergrowth. The footprints were easy to leave. The ground's soft near the edge of the clearing, muddy in patches. I left them leading from the forest to the porch, stopping just at the bottom of the steps. His boots had made a pattern of their own earlier in the day, so I knew he'd noticed the difference. I waited behind the cabin out of sight. He turned on the porch light after a while, bright enough that I could see his shadow move behind the curtains. The door didn't open though, he stayed inside. I wondered if he was standing by the window trying to figure out if there was someone out here. If he stepped out, I was ready, but he didn't. This morning he checked the perimeter. He circled the cabin twice, looking at the ground. I could tell he saw the prints, the way his shoulders tensed as he crouched to inspect them. He didn't go far into the woods, just a few steps before turning back. His head swiveled, scanning the trees. I stayed low, behind a ridge where the ground dipped. I could have stood there all day and he wouldn't have noticed me. By afternoon he started doing something different. He boarded up the windows. Not all of them, just the smaller ones on the side of the cabin that faced the woods. The hammering echoed through the forest, loud and jagged. He left the big front window uncovered though, the one by the door. I wondered if he thought I wouldn't come from that side, that I'd stick to the trees like some kind of animal. When night came, I moved in closer. I wanted to see his reaction, to feel the tension in the air. The porch light was on again, buzzing faintly. I crouched low, keeping to the edge of the trees. I'd left the forest behind earlier in the day, walking up to the door. His boots were there, just inside, lined up neatly by the threshold. I reached for the handle, testing it, but it was locked. That's when I slipped his phone out of his jacket, hanging on a peg by the door. He'd left it there like it wasn't important. The phone's in my pocket now, the screen dark. It buzzed once earlier, a notification he'll never see. He doesn't know it's gone yet. When he does, I want to be close enough to hear the moment it clicks in his mind. It's late now. The cabin's quiet. He's moving around less, probably trying to sleep. I wonder if he hears the sounds outside. The crack of a branch, the scrape of leaves. He's smart enough to know the forest's alive, full of things that don't care if he's there. But I know he'll still be listening, waiting for something he can't predict. The phone's still in my hand as I move back toward the porch. His footprints are there, mixing with the ones I left. The porch light flickers once and then everything plunges into darkness. The neighborhood is quiet as I sit in my car at the end of the street, the headlights off, the engine silent. The house is easy to pick out, the one with the little red tricycle left in the driveway. It's smaller than the place we used to share, the kind of house someone moves into when they're trying to disappear. The curtains are drawn, but I know she's inside. I've been here long enough to know her routines, when she puts the boy to bed, when the lights go out, when the street falls completely still. The first time I followed her here, she didn't notice. She doesn't look around the way she used to. Back then, she'd glance over her shoulder in parking lots or check the rear view mirror at stoplights. Not anymore. Maybe she thinks she's safe here, hidden away in this anonymous little street with its cul-de-sacs and neat gardens. She doesn't realize how easy it was to find her. The car alarm was an experiment. I wanted to see how she'd react. I parked a few streets away, walked back under cover of darkness, and triggered it with a spare fob I made when we were still together. It was almost funny how predictable she was. The lights came on inside, a figure moving behind the curtains. She came outside barefoot, looking around the driveway, her arms crossed against the chill. I stayed hidden in the shadow of a tree, close enough to see her, far enough that she couldn't see me. She didn't find anything, of course. I made sure of that. I've been doing it every few nights since. Sometimes I let a few days pass just to keep her guessing. It's not just the car. There's the back gate too. I've left it open a few times, just enough for her to notice. Once I put a cigarette butt near the bin, even though she doesn't smoke. Little things, subtle things, the kind of things that make her think she's losing her grip. The boy is an unexpected factor. He talks to her about me. I've heard him through the open window, his voice high and bright, mentioning the man outside. He's young enough that she brushes it off, or maybe she doesn't want to believe him. Either way, it doesn't matter. He's not my focus. The inside of the house is starting to come together. I can see through the curtains when the lights are on. The furniture is second-hand, the walls bare. There are toys scattered on the floor, a pile of laundry on the sofa. It's not like the home we had before. She's trying to start over, but it's messy, thrown together, unfinished. I've been closer than she realizes. The lock on the garage is flimsy, the kind you can force with a bit of pressure. I didn't take anything. That's not the point. I just wanted to see what she keeps in there. Boxes, mostly. A bike with a flat tire, some gardening tools. It's a peek into her new life, the one she thought I wouldn't find. The first time I saw her weeks ago, I felt a rush of something I can't explain. It wasn't anger, not exactly. More like satisfaction. She thought she could leave, that she could just pack up and slip away like I wouldn't notice. But I always notice. I know her better than she knows herself. I can see it in the way she moves, the tension in her shoulders when she steps outside, the way she hesitates before turning the key in the lock. Tonight, the house is quiet. The boy's tricycle is still in the driveway, one wheel resting on the edge of the curb. I parked farther away than usual, taking a longer route through the neighborhood to make sure no one saw me. I'm wearing gloves, not because I plan to touch anything, but because it feels right, careful, precise. I circle the house, staying close to the edge of the garden. The back gate is unlocked again. I left it that way yesterday. There's a window open upstairs, just a crack. I can see the faint glow of a nightlight spilling out. That's his room, I can tell by the curtains, blue with little rockets on them. He's probably asleep. There's a noise behind me, a cat darting through the bushes. I step back, melting into the shadows near the fence. The house remains still. I stay there for a while, watching, listening. The air feels colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps through your clothes. I don't stay long tonight, just enough to let her know I was here. I leave the gate open, wider than usual this time. On the way back to my car, I notice one of the neighbors' lights come on. Someone peers out, a shape behind the curtains, but they don't come out. I keep walking. When I drive away, the street is dark again, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror. I'll come back tomorrow or the day after. It doesn't matter. I know where she is now. That's all I need. I watch him from the cover of the trees, their bare branches bending in the wind. The house is dark, except for the faint glow of the living room window, and inside I can make out the shadow of him moving around. His shape is different than I remember. Broader, maybe, or just more tired in the way he carries himself. He's changed since we were together, but I suppose that's to be expected. People always do. The dog gives me away. Every night, it sniffs me out no matter where I stand. It starts with a low whine and then it barks. The noise rips through the stillness of the neighborhood. Tonight is no different. I see the moment the dog catches me in its senses. It's at the back door, its head lowered, ears pinned forward, a frenzy building in its throat. I stay where I am, letting the branches conceal me. The dog presses its nose to the glass, paws scratching at the door. I see him come into the room, his movements quick and agitated. He drags the curtains shut and the light in the window vanishes. Still, the dog keeps barking. I don't leave right away. I like to wait, to stand there until the dog tires itself out. Eventually, it will fall silent. He won't come outside. I know he won't. He's too careful for that. He'll check the locks on the windows and doors, make sure everything is secure. It's almost a routine now. He's made himself predictable. I've been coming to his house for weeks. It started as a way to see him again, but it's turned into something else. I don't know how to explain it. I just like being close to him, even if he doesn't know I'm here, especially because he doesn't know I'm here. There's something about the quiet moments in the early hours, when the world feels smaller and more fragile. When it's just me, the trees, and the cold air. I didn't expect him to buy cameras. I saw the first one 2 nights ago, mounted above the garage door. It's a cheap one, the kind you can buy online. The lens glints faintly when it catches the light. There's another one near the back porch, aimed squarely at the door where the dog always barks. He must think that will stop me. It won't. Last night I tested them. I stayed just out of view, skirting the edges of the frame. I know how they work. They're motion activated, only recording when something moves. I was careful to keep to the shadows, moving slowly enough that I barely triggered them. I didn't touch anything, just watched. Tonight I decide to get closer. I've been working my way up to it. It's not about getting inside, it's about seeing how far I can go before he notices. He's always been cautious, always paranoid. That's part of what I liked about him. But even he has his limits, everyone does. The dog sees me again as I step onto the porch. I'm careful to avoid the light from the cameras, staying in the blind spots. The dog throws itself against the glass, barking so loud I'm sure the neighbors will hear. I reach for the door handle. It's locked, of course, but I try it anyway, just to hear the soft click of resistance. I move to the window beside the door, pressing my fingers against the edge of the frame. It's sealed tight. Inside, the lights come on. I step back, retreating to the shadows of the trees. The dog's barking turns frantic as he storms into the room. I can see him through the glass, his face twisted with frustration. He shouts something at the dog, waving his arms, but it doesn't stop. He yanks the curtain closed again. I can almost feel his anger radiating out of the house. I know he's probably calling the police. He won't see anything on the cameras. I've been careful. But that won't stop him from checking, from spending hours watching the footage. He'll look for me, hoping for a glimpse of something he can't explain. That's what I want, for him to wonder, to lie awake thinking about me, just like I think about him. I stay for a while longer, watching the house. The dog's barking slows until it's just a low growl. Eventually the lights inside go off one by one. He's gone to bed. He probably won't sleep. When I finally leave, it's quiet again. The air is cold against my skin, the smell of the earth rising up around me. I know I'll be back tomorrow. I can't stay away.